All right. Um, Welcome everyone. If you happen to take our class on smart home load control last week, just as a quick update, I've taken that recording and turned it into a illustrated transcript. And I generally do these with most of my programs. What we're teaching for PDH Pro is a reduced version of some of our longer classes, and so I still have to generate some of these kind of detailed handouts, but they are available to you. So I thought I would mention it. Basically the lecture that you're hearing over the course of the next 2 hours, we go back and put in the slides and the transcript so that that can assist with you learning the material after class. So if you would like, I'm going to put in my email address into the chat room and you can message me and we will get you set up with the course handouts and updates after class. So let me get that real quick to everyone. So you should see my chat message now. You can just send me an email after class and we'll get you access to that. It may take us a few days to make this for this program, but nonetheless, we will get there. So diving into the content, the battery industry has been growing for some time now. It reminds me of what the solar industry was 10 years ago when I got into solar. And I got into solar because of its exponential growth rates. So batteries going through the same ramp up. I what's interesting about the battery market is it's primarily driven by the electric vehicle market. So a lot of the growth over the last 10 years in solar was the silicon industry saying, let's make solar power a real thing by scaling up our facilities. Whereas we're still kind of getting scraps of batteries from the electric vehicle market, which is the primary driver. Grid tied storage is something that's relatively new, and I think the applications should be better understood because I think that um, grid tied storage batteries could eclipse the battery demand for electric vehicles in the future, and it's really only being constrained by manufacturing capacity. Um, what I think is very interesting about grid tied batteries is that most of the projects by installed capacity are not paired with solar power. And so in the solar industry, we think we're the head honchos. We think, yes, the in the past solar has had batteries, but to make systems more cost effective, we've gotten rid of batteries. And isn't it cute that now some in some ways we're adding batteries back into the projects? Meanwhile, the battery industry is running ahead of us, saying we can be used for cars, we can be used for storage. It has the potential that the solar industry down the road will just be called the battery industry and solar will be an accessory to it. And lithium ion storage, while it is kind of accepted to be the standard thing you do today, and it's earned that position, it's still a very small portion of storage as far as electric power generation goes. Most of our storage is in water reservoirs and dams, where you turn a dam into a battery by just pumping the water back uphill. So a lot of our storage for our electric grid has been fossil fuel or nuclear fuel or mechanical gravity with dams, or there's some projects talking about lifting concrete up into the air. As far as mechanical storage goes, chemical storage is really not that common. And so what's happened over the past few years is that it's just the manufacturing base has increased and created this whole new market that looks so strong that it could change the whole electric grid. It could get us off of fossil fuels. It might create other problems in the process. I mean, it's not like lithium ion mining is environmentally friendly, but it could change our energy infrastructure in a fundamental way if it keeps going. Um, Now, in the past with expensive batteries, people have struggled to find the best use of them. Are they going to be used to fix grid voltage fluctuation issues, or to reduce peak demand on the grid? Who's going to own them and save money? Are we what is the battery there for backup, or is it there to fix peak energy economics? Nothing's really taken a lead in terms of battery applications. So this is a pretty open-ended market, and it's kind of up to building designers and building professionals to take the lead and say, no, this is a good use for batteries. So why don't we implement it in our system? In we don't have time in class to get into all applications of batteries. We're going to focus primarily on a good starting point, which is like Tesla Powerwall style batteries, with advice to what are they capable of, why are people buying them, what are they useful for. We'll have another class later on commercial batteries, which I think is probably the best battery market in the whole industry. Uh, Being able to provide backup power to a commercial business and also take advantage of that commercial business's electric rate structure, which is any demand kilowatt rate structure is battery friendly, and that's not necessarily a solar friendly rate structure. So the commercial solar market has been held back because the technology does not fit its rate structure very well. And in the solar industry, what batteries are doing is unlocking the commercial market for the very first time. So there hasn't been growth in commercial rooftop solar for the last 10 years, like in other market segments, like residential or utility scale, because of the lack of batteries. And it turns out that not all batteries are the same, and there are better, more expensive, pricier, top shelf lithium ion batteries that are best suited for the commercial market, and they're not necessarily what a residential customer would need. And so knowledge of different battery chemistries, that's something that we're trying to explain in class to give you an appreciation for which kind of battery you should select for introductory building storage, whether it be at the residential or commercial level, and not necessarily big giant battery commercial projects which warrant their own technology. People's imaginations on what they can do with batteries can get them in trouble, because we're going to see features like this is what you can do with a commercial battery, which is provide demand management. So solar should be reducing the facility's peak demand in the middle of the day. The problem is a partly cloudy day where the solar array isn't turned on, but the building's demand is still what it otherwise would be on a sunny day, but the solar array is not on. So you turn on a battery just on those kind of partly cloudy days during peak times. And if you get the right size between the solar array and the battery on the right peak rate structure, what that results in is peak power generation and peak power savings. And that can be the most cost effective application of solar in the industry. And whether it's a big giant commercial project or one Tesla Powerwall on a residential home, what it comes down to is understanding the customer's electric bill. And these technologies are expensive, so you have to do everything you can to make them cost effective. And often that means designing the array for the rate structure of the customer more than anything else. Say if we can optimize the design just for the rate structure and nothing else, that's going to be the best starting point. So commercial systems, you have to have a very clear understanding of what the load profile looks like, and see how much of their kilowatt load they can shave. Residential systems are more focused on this kilowatt hour rate, and that can get them into trouble too. it's not that there aren't residential rate structures available to make batteries cost effective. There are. Georgia Power, which is not a solar friendly utility by reputation, has a amazing rate structure for residential customers with batteries that gives them kind of real time electricity pricing like an industrial facility would get, and that's an amazing rate structure for batteries. So you can find battery friendly residential rate structures in unexpected places. Whenever you're doing batteries or solar, a great starting point is the utility website, looking at the different rate options available to your customers, and then picking one that says, hey, in my area, I have a time of use metering plan that uh, the peak period is only 3 hours for the entire day. And so all I really need is a battery sized enough to be 3 hours worth of storage. And that gets me through power outages, and that gets me through my time of peak rate, and that gives me a much quicker payback than any other option on the market. So um, to make these expensive batteries cost effective, you got to line everything up on the project correctly. And sometimes designing to the rate structure is the best strategy, given that most of your customers are not going to be off grid customers. Most of them are going to be grid tied customers. And for the most part, they'll have the security blanket of the electric grid to protect them. It's just about, how not to mess up the design of, their first Tesla Powerwall or oversell it. We're going to talk about some shortcomings in this program. So a lot of, say, residential customers look at batteries to be the savior of bad solar policy. So if we can keep that energy on site, then the debate between selling back to the utility and during times of overproduction no longer becomes an issue. And as we talk about in our solar classes, uh, the solar array only works for a third of the day or less, and so to generate 100% of an electric bill, at least 2/3 of a solar array's power needs to either be stored in a battery or sold back to the grid and then bought back at a fair price. And that's a whole debate. Do batteries fix that? Is it practical to store a day's worth of solar power in a battery, given that batteries are so expensive? And the answer is not always. I mean, sometimes that terrible utility solar buyback policy is still a better option than storing the energy in a battery, because batteries do not have infinite life. And so they wear out, and therefore they have a cost per cycle on average. And if that cost per cycle is cost more than the difference between the buyback rate and the generation rate, then you're wasting money by using your batteries. And there are some customers who say, I don't care, I'd rather waste my money than pay my electric bill because I want better solar policy. And at that point, you just shut up and sell them the battery that they want. um I'm really not interested in that market. I want when is it cost effective to put a lithium ion battery on a house? We're going to talk about that, but the answer is not always. We're going to talk about the cost of a lithium ion battery. It's about 17 cents a kilowatt hour up front, and then when you replace the batteries, maybe 9 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And so you have to have a differential of more than that, you know, 15 cents a kilowatt hour or greater between your peak and off peak rates for you to get any kind of money back on the project. Really, it should be twice that to get a really good value out of the project. But just to get your money back, it has to save you more money than it costs you to use the battery. And so batteries don't really help the economics of residential solar in a significant way, unless you have an extreme variable peak rate structure like many businesses do. Turns out I have one here in Mississippi, of all places. So, look around. There are opportunities out there. But a solar array without a battery cannot store its power. And that means it's kind of a dumb device rather than a smart device. So a solar array just wants to dump all of its power onto the grid, and that's it. And if the grid's not there to take it, it has safety measures built into its circuits to prevent it from operating. So, a solar array without a grid to tie into, whether it be the grid or a separate battery inverter, it can't turn on. And furthermore, when it does turn on, it wants to dump everything it has into that power source, and the power source has to be stable enough to take it. And so, furthermore, grid tied batteries, not only do they not address, the economic problems of not having net metering for residential customers, they're great for time of use metering where you have extreme differentials. The cynics in the industry think the power companies will never provide those extreme differentials, that they'll just keep them right at, a little bit less than the cost of battery storage. And who knows? Eventually, you do enough batteries that you can go completely off grid, but that's way too expensive to start out with. And then there's the other issue of, because of protecting the battery from the solar array, you might not have the performance out of the system you think you're going to have. Are you going to try and back up the whole house or just a critical load panel? There are technical differences. We're going to talk about those in a minute. But fundamentally, you buy a battery to have backup power on site. And even if it's inconvenient, so let's say you can only protect critical load panels with automatic transfer switches, but if you want to protect your entire house, you have to go, click a big clunky disconnect switch on the outside of your building to transfer the electricity over during a power outage. Well, you'll still have that electricity there during the power outage. So, it's not to say that off-grid or systems that can provide whole building power are hassle free or maintenance free, but the difference between having electricity and not having electricity is a huge selling point motivation to at least install a battery of some project price, $10,000, $5,000, something, make it a project. But there is some value in doing a solar battery project that has more to do with security rather than saving money off your electric bill. So solar inverters are dumb. Solar inverters are just one way. They take all the power from the solar array and dump it into the load. Battery inverters are two-way. Not only can they discharge power from the battery bank, but they can also charge the batteries. Not all batteries are like that. A grid tied bidirectional battery where you can just couple it right into the service panel. That's a bidirectional battery. So most battery inverters, most grid tied battery inverters that you're familiar with, the Tesla Powerwall is a bidirectional battery inverter. Let's say this was that distinguishes a battery inverter from any other battery that just plugs into a wall. Like if your laptop battery, your laptop cannot backfeed the power outlet in your wall and backfeed the grid. Your laptop battery is a one-way battery. A UPS system that has a battery there to protect a bank of electronics. That's not a one-way system. So you can buy battery inverters that have batteries that are just one way, that go off and protect critical loads, for example. But battery inverters, most battery inverters, the Tesla Powerwall is a two-way battery inverter. It can charge from the grid and it can discharge to the grid. And where one of the pitfalls of selecting a battery inverter, as we'll discuss, is that charging to the grid feature is not always as functional as what your imagination will allow. So we've just talked about peak demand shaving for commercial facilities, and we're going to talk about in just a few slides how there's companies out there advertising these abilities and not delivering them on the products that they say have these features. Fundamentally what they're saying is, on most battery inverters, there's batteries and then there's load panels that have tremendous one-way battery management function from the viewpoint of the battery system. But on this grid side that the battery inverter gets its charge from and then sometimes outflows to, that can have really dumb, poor, not very smart intelligence. And most solar inverters, to begin with, are dumb and don't have much intelligence on backfeeding the grid. But to do advanced smart features with the output of your battery system, you got to have not just a battery inverter, but one that's smarter than the average battery inverter. That can surprise some people. And we're going to give you some examples of that. Now, if you go on battery discussion forums, they're going to talk about charge controllers versus battery inverters. One's DC to DC, the other's DC to AC. And that leads a discussion of, is it better to have the solar array on its own inverter with the battery inverter AC coupled to it? Or is it better instead to just have the solar array directly plugged into the batteries and have the whole system on one battery inverter? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. You can do both. In fact, I have found that excuse me, I found that AC coupling is actually, if you're going to just choose one or the other, an AC coupling system is a little bit more idiot proof than a DC coupling system. And what is really the most important thing is you stick to one inverter manufacturer product line and use that all the way through the system as much as you can. And not all inverter manufacturers make DC coupled charge controller products. The big difference between AC coupling and DC coupling is, with AC coupling, you're actually buying two inverters, and so that might cost a little bit more, but not always. But you get the combined power output of both systems when the solar array is on. Whereas if you went with DC coupling, you don't get that advantage of having two inverters on site. So you can actually get more power out of an AC coupled system than you can with a DC coupled system for about the same price. So DC coupling wins the theoretical technical argument on which is better, for reasons we don't have time to discuss. But pragmatically, AC coupling is winning because there's more manufacturers of inverter products than there are of charge controller products. So, most residential grid-tied systems are going to be AC coupled battery inverters on their own battery inverter, and that's a valid design solution. Although in the solar industry, we are seeing more and more hybrid inverter solutions come to the market. It's not that these things are bad. There's really whether you use an all-in-one inverter or the solar inverter and the battery inverter are separated, it all comes down to, you just want one manufacturer driving the whole ship. So these are charge controllers, and they're very popular in the off-grid community, in small solar, tiny houses, and traditional, like 1980s, 1990s solar projects. They all had charge controllers on them. And what that charge controller would do is it would take the input of the solar array with voltages that jump up and down. And much like, a micro inverter or a DC optimizer, more specifically, on a rooftop, it takes that fluctuating solar voltage and outputs a stable voltage back to the inverter that And that inverter, appreciates a stable voltage a lot more than a fluctuating voltage. It makes the inverter cost less money. So, traditional solar projects always had a charge controller to stabilize the DC voltage before it hit a battery, before it hit an inverter. Batteryless systems got rid of the charge controller because they could say, well, let's just do it all in the inverter anyway. Solar Edge, which is kind of one of the best performing solar manufacturers on the stock market, is the reason why they're so successful is they invented a DC charge controller that goes behind each solar panel on the rooftop. That was not for battery systems. It was just for optimizing the solar production. And then National Electric Code came through and mandated each module have intelligence, be able to shut itself down on command. And so Solar Edge became like, the cheapest, most code compliant solution on the market. And turns out that they were trying to invent a quality product to go above code, but then code caught up with uh, solar design and basically mandated these things on the rooftop. So there are charge controllers in the solar industry still. They're just at higher voltages. Most of these uh, charge controllers on the market were designed for, you know, off-grid living. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between grid-tied batteries and off-grid batteries, but all of this stuff is built around 48 volts. And sometimes for homes, just a regular home load, not an off-grid cabin in the woods, but a regular house, a 48 volt battery system is going to be underpowered. It can be a fire hazard. If you draw too much power out of a 48 volt battery bank, it cannot work or misfunction. There's a upper limit, an upper physical limit to how much power you can draw out of a battery. It'd be like if you try and run your whole house off a double A 2 volt battery, nothing will happen. So finally, there's another battery inverter system called grid assist, and this is these one-way battery inverters. So the grid comes out and then it goes and powers a load. And sometimes these inverters, because technically they're not backfeeding the grid, they can be cheaper to make. Like if you want to run your whole house off grid but then have a grid charger connection, a grid assist inverter would fit the bill. But for the most part, you're buying grid assist inverters because you're cheap and you want to save money on your project costs, because these inverters, they cost less. The downside is, the inverter is the last place on your project you want to cheap out on. So you really shouldn't be doing a project if all you can do is afford a grid assist inverter. I have not had good luck running homes on grid assist inverters. They're really designed for like RVs, temporary housing, not United States residential grid tied living. Where a grid assist configuration could fit into a residential home is wherever you might need just a one-way inverter, like in a server room as a UPS system. Running it all on a grid assist inverter, is not a terrible idea. In fact, in a truly off-grid home, having like cascading 12 kilowatt or less 100 amp service panels throughout the house, each with their own battery backup and grid assist inverter, that could only help the source input into the home and help the home, if it is running off grid, having distributed batteries throughout the house might become a thing. So the question is, can you use a residential grid-tied battery to kind of achieve mastery over your electric load profile as you can do on more expensive commercial systems? What is not readily apparent about battery inverters that are two directional, that can charge from the grid and discharge to the grid, is they might actually have two different output ports, one for the grid coming in and one for the grid coming out. So it's not just like a two-way street that goes, one way and the other. It's not like a solar array that has one set of wires connected to it. Of course, that solar array is just doing a one-way output from the array. It's not charging the solar array with current. And so battery inverters, even though they're bidirectional, they have a separate input from the grid and a separate output from the grid, and maybe even a third output for a critical load panel or backup load panel. So here's some ratings for the inverter output, and it's saying, okay, its total power output range is 6,800 watts. So this is a 6.8 kilowatt battery inverter, and it can actually surge. So if it goes above 6.8 kilowatts, it can do 8.5 for 30 minutes. You can also do 12 kilowatts for 60 seconds. What I would have to say about surge loads in a house is they usually run for 8 to 10 to 12 minutes in that range, like a air conditioning unit or a electric tank water heater. They don't run for 30 seconds and then stop. They go, most go longer than 60 seconds. So I wouldn't really take into account this maximum surge load capacity when you're just trying to say, okay, well, if we exceed our power, what happens? If you exceed your power slightly on a battery inverter, it can take it. But if you go over what it can output safely in, within a minute, it shuts off. So if you overload a battery inverter, it will turn itself off because the conductors wired up to that battery inverter are only rated for its continuous output rating. So it's not an inverter that can do higher output sustained for very long. So we ran into an issue where we were doing a grid assist home, and the home's electrical scope just kept growing and growing and growing, and all of a sudden exceeded the capabilities of the system, and we had to implement digital load controls for that home to operate within the system parameter. That's off-grid stuff. Here's the grid tie output range. It says you can input how much current you want to sell back. You can say, okay, with the battery voltage, depending on the grid voltage, you can use the inverter to help stabilize that grid voltage or raise that grid voltage. You can do frequency control. These are utilities kind of can like some of these advanced features. Here's a side. There's the side that deals with outputting to the grid, and then there's the side that deals with charging from the grid into the battery. So it's telling us that there might be a difference between the charge rate of the batteries and the discharge rate from the inverter. More importantly, it's telling us the voltage range of these batteries, and that's important because there's a lot of 48 volt stuff out there, and not all residential batteries are 48 volts. Some are much higher than that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then there's a limit, and mostly the limit's on the small side to what's the smallest battery you can fit on a battery inverter. We're going to talk about discharge rates of batteries. We're going to talk about 2-hour rates, 5-hour rates, 10-hour rates. If that battery gets small enough, it could be fully discharged in a half an hour based on the power rating of the inverter. And so the rule of thumb for battery bank sizing on inverters is to know what is your battery chemistry's discharge rate standard. Is it a forklift battery is standard at a 6-hour discharge rate. Most other lead acid, and even with forklifts, you would usually do a 10-hour very still considered, you're pressing it. Maybe design off a 20-hour discharge rate for lead acid, and you're where you should be. um, Lithium ion's discharge rate is more 2.5 hours or so. And so if you take your inverter output capacity and then you multiply by 2.5, that's going to give you your smallest estimate for lithium ion battery bank size. So there is in the spec sheet a number that they say this is the smallest amount of battery storage we recommend you have. But it really depends off on the battery chemistry. And for lithium ion, entry level lithium ion, you're looking at 2.5 times the output capacity of the inverter should be the minimum battery bank size. If you're going with a solar battery, this is United States battery inverter startup. There's a few of them in this space, and this is kind of the latest and greatest. And they are kind of trying to make the battery inverter that everyone thinks a battery inverter is. So Solark's worth checking out in terms of technical specs. They do DC coupling built into the array. So if you're already doing a solar array, they have you can just land your solar array straight on the inverter. And then they have AC coupling output. And the end result is, DC coupling technically is a little bit cheaper, and you kind of see that in their pricing. It's not an inexpensive product by any means, but if you stack up the cost effectiveness of an all-in-one unit, if it actually does what you need it to do, that is a cost-effective form factor. And then they're saying, our system has a transfer rate that is as fast as a UPS system. Not all grid assist inverters can function as a UPS system. And if it doesn't transfer due to a power outage quickly, then it can cause blips in like your internet and stuff like that. And not everyone wants their internet to blip every time the power goes out. So they use higher end components so that you can have it be as a UPS, and also they have smart programmable outputs to the grid, which is a feature we're about to talk about. This is a company, Schneider. They're just, Acme. They're a big name brand. No one would really consider them a solar brand. They're more just wholesale electronics. They own Square D. They're just, you see their trucks driving down the road no matter where you are in the country. And they have a solar division. And these two inverters are not the same inverter. This is their old battery inverter, and this is their new battery inverter. As you can tell, they're much different from each other. You open up the XW Pro spec sheet, and it advertises smart energy management. You open up the old XW Plus spec sheet, and its features have been scrubbed away, and it no longer advertises the features that are directly mentioned in its manual, which is things like load shifting and peak load shifting and self-consumption and time of use grid sellback. All these features we had talked about so far have been listed as features that a battery inverter delivers, but this Schneider inverter, it only delivers those features on the critical load panel side that it's tied into, and not on the grid connected side. And so if you just want to take a battery inverter and plug it into the grid and have all these intelligent energy management features in addition to some backup power supply, not all name brand battery inverters can do that. A lot of these name brand battery inverters have been designed for the off-grid market where you just don't need those features. But what that means is, unless you do the whole house off grid, you don't have the intelligent capability. And all that's changing. Schneider they haven't updated their battery and product in 8 years, but they did update. They didn't give it a facelift, but they did update its control boards so that It's now advertising smart energy management. And what that smart energy management means is that they now can regulate intelligently the output on the grid connected AC side and not just the output on the critical load side. And that's a world of difference. It's a world of difference for a grid tied battery. You have to have for a grid tied residential battery, you have to have intelligence on the AC output side in order to save any money on your electric bill at all. You have to be able to truly implement time of use peak load shifting or demand management. Otherwise, your battery is just an expensive UPS system for when the power goes out. You'll never get a payback out of it. All right. So battery chemistries and their uses. So I've been talking a lot about lithium ion. Would you not use lead acid ever? Well, one day we're going to get to the point, and maybe one day soon where that answer is yes. We're going to talk about a, a specific case on grid tied batteries where lead acid is not a terrible recommendation. Um, in fact, if you want to recommend brand new batteries and not get into the realm of like do it yourself hobbyist packages, even today, recommending lead acid is not the worst thing to do for a grid tied battery. Um, but technically there are differences in discharge rates between lead acid and lithium ion. And so we talk about a responsive battery. What makes a responsive battery? Why can you discharge lithium ion more quickly than lead acid? And really that's not the whole story. There's other kinds of battery technologies, mechanical and chemical, that can be charged and discharged more quickly and more efficiently than lithium ion batteries, except they can be very dangerous because they store so much power, um, or they can be very expensive, super capacitor or both. So capacitors store batteries differently than chemical batteries, but they're super expensive. Capacitors are in your camera to charge the flash bulb, but they're not very big. They don't store a lot of electricity. To have a capacitor that runs a whole house, they can cost millions of dollars. Flywheels do have their uses, and one advantage of flywheels that they have is they can be charged and discharged in a matter of seconds rather than minutes. And so elevator systems have flywheels built into them to store the momentum from the elevator and use as much as it can to send the elevator back uphill the other way. And so the flywheels still make sense in elevator systems as compared to using like regenerative braking to generate electricity to charge a battery. What that also means is lithium ion isn't perfect. Lithium ion does not have the same discharge rates as other technologies on the market. It's just, at a good value or price point, or at least, the best of the bunch. It's no promise. There's no one saying that this stuff isn't inexpensive. We don't have energy storage because it's expensive. And then there's other kind of utility scale battery projects that are very large and only concerned with providing base load electricity and not peak load electricity. And so down the road in the future of society, we might have different batteries doing base load and more responsive batteries doing peak load, but that's not the starting point. Lead acid, it requires maintenance, it requires watering, it has a 20-hour discharge rate, which means that lead acid really what it wants is an electric load that will drain the battery over the course of a day, and not electric load that over the course of the day the load's jumping up and down and up and down, and for 15 minutes it could discharge the battery over a course of 4 hours, but then for the rest of the time the battery's not being used. When we're talking about a 20-hour discharge rate, we're talking about that's the maximum load it's receiving, not the average load it's receiving. Like, if it could be discharged at a constant load for 20 hours, not a variable load for 20 hours. A variable load would be a lot harder on a battery than a constant load. And so with saying that a lead acid battery really wants a 20-hour discharge rate, what we're really saying is, when you get into cost-effective lead acid batteries, as a starting point, you're going to be storing multiple days of storage. And so the question is, like, well, what is a good starting point for a lead acid battery? If it's a whole house backup system, you still have to buy a couple of days worth of storage just to deliver, a consistently performing product. If you do a battery bank flooded lead acid for the whole house, you might say, well, let's only do a day of storage or a half day of storage. Well, the variable load on a house is tremendous. And so, even if you have the right sized inverter and the right sized battery, if you're blowing out at the peak load discharge rate of a C6 or a C5, it's not going to have that 8 hours of storage. It's going to have less than that. And so, maybe on a off-grid home, you solve that by just having a very large lead acid bank. There are lead acid battery bank owners who have tremendous results because they made the upfront investment to buy multiple days worth of storage. But lead acid really wants a constant base load throughout the day, and it would be best to have peak loads managed by something else. And that's why it would be nice for these battery inverters to have intelligent AC output, so that you could have a battery inverter with a lithium ion battery for peak load, and then maybe a dumber battery with a cheaper battery technology for base load as a complex system. We're not going to spend too much more time talking about lead acid, because I think lithium ion is where most grid tied batteries are going to start out with, except for a special case that we'll talk about. But if you look at a lead acid battery spec sheet, you'll get different amounts of storage capacity for if it's discharged over a 20-hour period, or over a 10-hour period, or over a 5-hour period. You'll get this many total amp hours out of it at its voltage. So what you're seeing is the kilowatt hour storage capacity of the battery is decreasing as the discharge rate increases. So the faster you discharge a lead acid battery, the less capacity it has in it. And there's a point of no return where, if you notice on this sheet, they're not giving you a 2-hour discharge capacity. They're giving you a 100-hour discharge capacity. You can see the energy. The battery's even more efficient at a 100-hour discharge rate than a 20-hour discharge rate. So it's these off-grid customers on giant lead acid battery banks that have 3 days or more, 4 days or more storage, that are having really good experiences with their lead acid batteries. If you have less than 3 days, less than 4 days worth of storage, you're not going to have the same experience. The closer you get to this 5-hour discharge rate, the more inefficient your system becomes. And it's actually a logarithmic decay curve. And so that means, right when you start going past the 5-hour, 20 hours is right up here. This is the difference between the 20-hour discharge rate and the 100-hour discharge rate. That's the walkable part of the curve. as soon as you start going past 20-hour discharge rate, you start sliding down the funnel. So once you get past 5 hours, a 5 hour discharge rate, you're just gonna burn up the battery trying to discharge it too quickly. All you're gonna do is generate a bunch of heat, maybe cause a system failure. At the very least, your system's not going to sustain the demand, and it's not going to turn on whatever it's trying to turn on. And so, I'm also not trying to say that you can't put a load on a lead acid battery for 30 seconds that is beyond its C5 rating, but any kind of continuous sustained load that's large is going to be very hard on it. And this is going to come back to lithium ion batteries in a minute, but the traditional battery spec sheets have had these charts where you say, okay, well, what is my daily energy use and what is my storage capacity, and that'll tell me how deeply I'm discharging my battery on a daily basis. And based off your depth of discharge, you could go and determine how many cycles of battery life you have. If you have 3,650 cycles, then you're going to have per year, you're going to have a 10-year, battery. Or if you have a cycle a day and you have 3,650 cycles in your battery, that's a 10-year battery. And we can talk about how lithium ion batteries are better than lead acid and all their technical details, but generally all of this stuff just improves the more premium your battery becomes. And even within lead acid, there's a huge range of difference. And so, all of these are lead acid batteries. Forklift batteries are in a category called industrial flooded lead acid, and that's the best lead acid technology. But there's other lead acid batteries that are marketed as off-grid or solar or deep cycle or premium renewable energy batteries that do not have the performance of forklift batteries. So they're not as good. They're cheaper. They have less upfront cost, worse overall performance. And then you get to zero maintenance lead acid batteries. And those are kind of like lithium ion in that they are sealed batteries. And because they're sealed, no water escapes as water vapor. So you don't need to re-water your batteries. Well, that sounds pretty good. I don't want battery maintenance. Lithium ion battery is a sealed battery. When you look at the difference between a sealed lead acid and an unsealed lead acid, the sealed lead acid costs more money. And right here in the marketing data of the sealed battery, they're showing the purchase price of the sealed battery is more than the unsealed battery. It costs more money to make a sealed battery than an unsealed battery. That's simple. Okay, so then they're saying, well, watering and maintenance costs are a large part of a unsealed battery maintenance, and you don't have to do that with a sealed battery. And this is for a battery that's called a valve regulated battery, where you still have to water it, but not nearly as much. And at any rate, they're saying, well, buy the sealed battery because over time the cost of maintenance will catch up with it and it'll be more cost effective. Well, when you look at the technical performance differences between sealed lead acid and unsealed lead acid, the unsealed lead acid batteries can be much more cost effective over the long run. The maintenance tasks on batteries are not very difficult, and the fact that it's unsealed and lets the water vapor escape that needs to be refilled with watering your batteries. That also means you can subject the battery to more aggressive charges, and sometimes you apply a really high charge to a battery to condition it. So you can condition unsealed batteries, whereas you can't condition sealed batteries. And that means not only do the sealed batteries cost more money, up front, but they also have shorter performance and life all around. And so it sounds like sealed batteries are they're not as good economically compared to unsealed. Now, some things you get with a sealed battery is no maintenance, and that can be a strong asset to many of these kinds of customers. Um, the way that the sealed occurs is sometimes a gel, and with a gelled battery rather than a flooded water battery, the gel batteries can be lay on their sides. This is kind of stuff that we'll talk about more in the off-grid battery class. Um, but even basic things like, okay, let's just say that the cheapest lead acid battery was in fact the cheapest and therefore a viable option to consider. A sealed battery, because it doesn't produce that gas, it can be in a unvented cabinet. A battery that gets large enough for commercial systems, or a battery that emits gas on its own has to have ventilation requirements that are built into fire code, including continuous ventilation. At any rate, we're going to leave the maintenance and battery discussion for battery maintenance for kind of an off-grid discussion held at a later time, because none of this stuff you're going to worry about, because customers for grid tied batteries, lithium ion is well in the lead. So all I would say is sometimes the literature can say, sealed batteries do not need equalization. Equalization, that aggressive charge that you apply to an unsealed battery, helps it last longer, and that results into longer cycle life ratings on the spec sheet. So, it's not an advantage of a sealed battery that you don't need to maintain it. It's just a difference, and it results in a more expensive battery. And so, how do batteries? We're going to take a break right at the top of the hour for 10 minutes. But how do batteries decay? How do batteries work, for that matter? Basically, you have a conductive liquid. That conductive liquid is water, but then they mix enough stuff into it that it helps with its conductivity. It's more like salt water than fresh water. So even though batteries can freeze, they don't freeze at 32 degrees. They freeze closer to 5 degrees. Batteries in extreme temperatures, you would put a little heating element inside the battery box to keep them warm. When batteries degrade, there's not much degradation on the positive side. There's more degradation on the negative side, the cathode versus the anode. And by degradation, what I mean is the surface of this anode, as the electrons are being passed from the anode through the electrolyte, like at this point, there's little chemical reactions that occur, and these chemical reactions will result in material plating this surface. And once that surface fills up with plating, then the electrons can no longer pass through. And removing this plating is what the equalization process does, that high voltage agitated charge. And you can't do that with a sealed battery. If you overcharge a sealed battery, the battery shape will swell, and it's that gas that's being produced from this aggressive charge trying to get out of the battery. So you'll damage the battery by overcharging it. And for that reason, you can condition unsealed batteries. You can't condition sealed batteries. Furthermore, the higher performance the battery, the more you can charge and discharge it, when that plaque inevitably builds up over a very long-lasting, very high-end, top-shelf battery, that plaque is tougher than your typical plaque. And so chemical lithium ion batteries eventually, no matter how good they are, get covered in this, shell that degrades the anode, at which point you have to take the whole battery apart, at which point, you replace the battery. Okay, so with that, we're at our halfway point. We're going to take a 10-minute break. When we come back, we're going to focus more on lithium ion batteries and then talk about some design examples, and then uh, and focus more on kind of application and case uses. So we've talked about some technical specs, talk a little bit more about technical specs, but more with lithium ion in mind, and then point out some things that you need to know on your project going into it, and kind of give you some next steps for speccing out your system. So with that, let's take a 10-minute break. It is, let me check my official time here. I got 12:02. Let's take a 13-minute break. We'll pick back up at a quarter after. We're going to pick back up in about a minute or so. I think Jerry's going to want you all to check back in too with your microphone to just say hello. So if you're already back in your seats, unmute yourself, say hi and your name. Just ask any questions too. Now's a good time to ask some questions. Cool. All right. With that in mind, let's get back into it. So the Tesla Powerwall is obviously the most popular system by brand name recognition, and I'd also say it's not a bad value, kind of begrudgingly. Tesla's increased the size of the Powerwall from the Powerwall 1 to the Powerwall 2, and they're the same batteries they use in their vehicles they use in the Tesla Powerwall. They have really good purchasing power and lots of kind of field testing experience with what are actually low end uh, lithium ion batteries in the grand scheme of things. They're trying to make a really nice Honda of a battery rather than something that's top shelf that you might use in a more specific case use. Yeah, more specific case use being that this Tesla battery is really designed around about a 2.5 hour discharge rate. And what's interesting about this battery is it's 13.5 kilowatt hours, and the continuous output rating of the Tesla Powerwall is 5 kilowatts. And so they are almost like how Apple doesn't give its users as much access to the phone as like Linux, but Apple delivers a very good user experience because they limit their features. Tesla is limiting the usability of the battery by giving it this 5 kilowatt continuous output. Now, could you discharge a lithium ion battery faster than that? Probably. But is it a good idea? No. Just like with a lead acid battery, the faster you discharge the battery, the worse it is for it fundamentally. And that does not change with lithium ion versus lead acid, except that lithium ion's a little bit tougher. Instead of really not being able to handle less than a 6 hour discharge rate or a 5 hour discharge rate with lead acid, is like beyond that you've done a bad job with your design. With lithium ion, it's more closer to 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And so Tesla is limiting the maximum discharge rate of their battery to be about 2.5 hours. And so that actually makes a designer's job a lot easier, because it's like, okay, well, if I'm designing a critical load panel, then I know that the maximum load for the critical load panel should be 5 kilowatts or so. Maybe slightly more than that, since all the loads aren't going to be on at the same time. In our smart home load control class, we talk about how you can use wall plugs and stuff like that to extend how many devices you can plug into this backup power. But that would mean my critical load panel would have about 5 kilowatts worth of devices on it, and that if all of those devices were on at the same time, it would run for at least 2.5 hours, maybe longer. So maybe you could get 5 or 6 hours of capacity if the devices are running at a 30% utilization rate. Um, a lot of power outages are not more than an hour or so, and so really the main issue with the Tesla Powerwall is it's cost. It's expensive, And then also 5 kilowatts is just not large enough to run heavy duty electrical devices. So, um, an air conditioner runs at a little under 5 kilowatts, and if it's a really hot day and the air conditioner ices up, it has electric defrosters on it that sometimes kick in on a winter setting to provide electric heat as an assist to a heat pump for comfort, not for efficiency. So even though it's a 4 kilowatt continuous air conditioner, sometimes it can surge up to you know 10 kilowatts, a little more than that. And so the Tesla Powerwall by itself is not powerful enough really to run an air conditioner. So it can back up some devices for hours, but it's not trying to run your whole house. You would have to buy multiple power walls to do that. At which point you're just adding kilowatt hours and also adding power output capacity. Buying 4 Tesla power walls is probably what it takes for most customers to feel like they have what they're paying for in terms of residential home power supply and backup capability. And even then, if you bought 4 of them, that's only 20 kilowatts of continuous output. An electric service panel is 240 volts, times 200 amps. That 200 amp main breaker. An electric service panel is about 48 kilowatts of maximum capacity. It's not that homes ever get up to 48 kilowatts. They don't, but they do get up to 25 kilowatts if all of the devices turn on at the same time and they have very kind of electric heavy devices. So let's look at some other features. Different modes of operation. Tesla kind of focused on making a grid-tied inverter rather than an off-grid inverter. And it says it's scalable up to 10 power walls. And that's a really important feature when planning these when selecting a battery inverter. Not all battery inverters can operate, alongside other manufacturers' equipment or even alongside their own manufacturer's equipment. And the problem when you buy kind of all-in-one inverter systems is sometimes not all of those inverters are stackable. Now, when you're working with grid-tied battery inverters, most grid-tied battery inverters, bidirectional battery inverters capable of outflowing onto the grid are stackable within their same ecosystem. So a Tesla is stackable with another Tesla, a Schneider is stackable with another Schneider, but not necessarily vice versa. There's some additional controls to look into. We'll talk about in a bit. They're mounted on the floor or on the wall. They weigh, 275 pounds. So, you need, 2 or 3 workers or a hoist to pick them up. Now you have an operating temperature of -4 to 122 degrees. And so, a Tesla is a liquid electrolyte battery. Lithium ion can freeze. It doesn't freeze at 32. It freezes at -4. And so, you don't want to keep one of the, a Tesla battery. You don't want to put it outside. Many people will put them in their garage. And, the garage is a good spot for, a battery. It's outside the house. It's a sealed battery, so it doesn't have the space requirements, and often they can be landed along the wall in a garage and still be in a code compliant fashion. A little bit harder to do that inside, but there's more places you can land them inside than you could a traditional battery. Their dimensions are 44 inches by 29 inches by 5.5 inches. So these things are, one thing that makes a Tesla nice is that it's just 6 inches off of the wall. Most of inverter electronics are a little bit deeper than that. So how do we break apart the cost and see what we're getting? Well, just the material for the Tesla Powerwall, and hey, the main criticism of the Tesla Powerwall is just they don't make enough of them. I mean, that's the what installers hate about Tesla is it's like, well, they're setting, pricing benchmarks, but then their availability is so constricted that it kind of, is like ruining the market for installers. But whatever. You can assume that a Tesla project is going to have a higher installation fee, um, for one thing, because of that constricted supply chain. One power wall costs $6,000, and then you have to buy some additional hardware for it. So just the material cost of the Tesla Powerwall, around $6,600, for 13.5 kilowatt hours of storage. That means their system costs $490 for every kilowatt hour of storage. So a home in the course of a month uses 1,000 kilowatt hours. To have a month's worth of lithium ion storage capacity is $500,000. That for a home, that's not something anyone's going to do. Of course, you are buying both the battery inverter and the battery itself. And so if you just kind of say, well, half of this is in electronics costs and the other half of it is in lithium ion batteries cost, you have to be able to separate those numbers out from each other. But it's also useful to know the kind of the all-in value of the hardware of what you're getting. Now, in the past with batteries, you determine their life and their utility, you would have to look at their depth of discharge and their cycle chart and determine how many cycles there were and do the calculation that way. Tesla having a battery that can efficiently operate within a 2.5 hour discharge, and they're limiting the battery to doing no more than that with its hardware. They're just not giving you the cycle chart anymore. They're just saying, hey, we're going to warranty the battery for either 10 years for unlimited cycles, where we guarantee the battery bank to still be able to store 70% of its value at 10 years. So that's the one warranty. You're never going to worry about that warranty, because what that's assuming is that the battery is just being gently used, that it's just hanging out on the wall, not doing anything. And actually, that's not a bad strategy. If you're in a market where it makes sense to sell back to the grid because that's a better rate than what the cycle cost of the battery is, then why not just have that battery sit there and not do anything and just be there for a power outage? I would say the customer motivation is that key here. When I talk to my solar customers, they do not like the idea of spending additional $10,000 to add lithium ion batteries to their project and then not use them to lower the electric bill. And even when I explain, hey, you're gonna spend more money this way because it costs more money to store the energy in the battery than to sell back to the grid. A healthy section of them says, well, it's my battery and I want to use it and I'm trying to lower my electric bill, and that's the point. And I'm just going to lower my electric bill. I don't care what the math says. And that's saying, hey, customers value, what they're buying. They want to use it. They want to have that storage. They also don't want to worry about their electric bill. They want to have more control. Long story short, Tesla says, well, if you're using the lithium ion battery to lower your electric bill actively on a day-to-day basis or do fun things with it, then we're going to give you a warranty for kilowatt hours output. We'll say within 10 years, we're going to warranty the battery up to 37,800 kilowatt hours or 37.8 megawatt hours. And once you're beyond that throughput of the system, you're out of warranty. So you can actually go and say, okay, well, I plan on using, X many kilowatt hours a day to get X many cycles. And what we could do right now is say, well, how long is this at 37,800 kilowatt hours, if we do a cycle a day, how long is that battery, to last? A way we can kind of shortcut that math is just to say, well, how much is that kilowatt hour out of the whole system going to cost? So if we take the material cost and we divide by the warranty, we get to about 17 cents per kilowatt hour. And so, and I'm making an assumption here. It's kind of a big assumption, okay? But I'm assuming that, based off my knowledge of battery inverter costs and things like that, that it's about 50% hardware and 50% batteries. And so each of these things, the battery and the hardware are costing about 9 cents a kilowatt hour, because 10 years is at the upper limit of a hardware warranty on a battery inverter. And what this is really saying is, well, if the battery inverter is still functioning, if they went and swapped out just the lithium ion batteries, then maybe that's going to cost 9 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So do you back these numbers out or not? We need to do we need to know how to back them out for kind of an apples to apples comparison with other products. But let's not lose sight that the end game is, this Tesla Powerwall system is costing about 17 cents a kilowatt hour just in the material to be installed and used over its life. And so, in markets where that time of use rate is nowhere in the realm of this amount, if that difference between saving money on your electric bill with your solar array and the buyback rate from the utility versus their retail price of electricity, if that difference is less than 17 cents a kilowatt hour, and it often is, buying a Tesla Powerwall and installing it to fix the utility buyback rate issue, it just won't work. But what it might do is, pay for itself over its life while giving you battery backup, or it might provide cheap battery backup, or a way to get a little bit of the money on battery backup back into your pocket. But it's still expensive. There's certain markets and in other countries where, and in major cities like New York or California, you can get to electricity pricing where the time of day rates are this much. And even in Biloxi, Mississippi, you can find a particular electric cooperative with time of day rates that are greater than this. So if I can save 30 or 40 cents a kilowatt hour, avoiding peak rate versus off peak, then go right ahead. But as far as energy savings go, to save money with residential batteries, you got to have a differential of 17 cents a kilowatt hour or greater, and then kind of assume the hardware you might get to keep at the end of the life. And if you went and replace the batteries, it might be another 9 cents on top of that to repeat the process. So I don't think there's tremendous amount of savings to be had in installing the infrastructure now and relying on the cost of cheap batteries to replace to be the motivator. Well, this chart is kind of interesting. It shows lithium ion battery duration and the overall trend being up. And so, the Tesla Powerwall is doing 2.5 hours of storage, and some projects have less storage than that. The trend is the cheaper storage gets, the more hours of storage people want to buy. What we are talking about here is that even lithium ion has a kind of logarithmic decay curve of performance the faster it gets discharged associated with it. So a lot of lithium ion warranties are broken out to say, well, are you, when you're doing your cycles, are you cycling down to 80% and leaving a 20% reserve capacity, or are you doing a full 100% cycle, at which point we give you different warranty values? That's a different way of saying, hey, don't discharge the whole battery so quickly. Stay at a slower pace of discharge and be easier on the battery, so that it'll last longer. Even top shelf lithium ion um, chemistries that are better than the Tesla Powerwall have these kind of go gentle on the battery usage, and you get a better warranty kind of shapes of their warranties. And all that implies is that maybe lithium ion batteries are a little bit closer to lead acid in the fact that they're not 15-minute batteries. You have to start out with about 2.5 hours of storage for entry level lithium ion. In the commercial classes, we talk about even more expensive lithium ion that can be discharged even more quickly. But the thing is, there are certain loads that are only 15-minute loads and not 30-minute loads or 2-hour loads, that a commercial utility might want to reduce. And so in those very specific heavy duty industrial cases, you can be justified to buy a way more expensive battery than what you would use for even 2 hours worth of backup storage. But that's really requires we have a right sizing those projects classes coming up with PDH Pro. But to size a residential battery, a really good starting point is just to find the energy use during that peak rate. So if your peak rate is only 3 hours, then that's a good battery size. If your peak rate is 8 hours, then that's anything larger than that is going to not be as cost effective. And so it actually reduces the size of the required solar power and the complexity of the required solar power on site, for that matter. If you wanted to add a solar array to this, it would qualify the battery for the solar tax credit. But instead of covering the whole house with solar, even though this is where solar installers might start throwing food at me and tell me to get off the stage, the optimal system, if you're doing a battery for time of day storage, maybe doing a smaller solar array that's only there to fill the battery back up with energy and qualify it for the tax credit. That could mean only adding 3 or 4 solar panels to the system, or one circuit of solar panels. Maybe not 4 panels, but maybe 8 or 9 panels. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But for sizing loads, it really is best to get a picture of what the actual load you're trying to size looks like, and not rely on the spec sheet items, because devices use their energy differently than what the spec sheets are. Is that amperage rating the amperage rating of the device when it's always on, or does the device kind of power cycle up and down? When I'm doing off-grid design, often you don't have that data, but you might have month-to-month electric bills of the old home, and then you can assume that the new home is larger or smaller than the older home, installed in the same region. What I try and do is get the electric bills of a similar person in a similar region, if that's possible. What we did to generate these graphs is we took the 12-month electric data, how much energy the customer used in a given month, and we just assumed an average rate of discharge every day, and then and then just guess that. You use 1,000 kilowatt hours over the course of the month, so you use 30 kilowatt hours a day. An actual model of real data, you're going to get some volatility. You're going to get some heavy days and some cloudy days. What we've done in this model is said, well, we want a solar array to fill that back up. And so we have a solar array on site recharging the battery and offsetting the discharge. Sometimes these solar battery systems can be very inefficient because the solar array might be capable of charging this much, but once you hit the top of the battery capacity, you either have to sell that electricity back or your batteries are full and you lose it. But that's kind of off-grid design. Usually with grid tied, you can just sell back the surplus to the grid, and for that matter, that's why some intelligent features of existing products aren't as intelligent as you'd think they'd be, because often the solution is, well, no matter what, you wouldn't want to just waste this electricity, so we didn't give you any ability to throttle it on the grid output side because we thought that you'd either be opting for a self-consumption mode of operation or be selling anything back out to the grid. Nowadays, you have more variable constraints, like the utility is saying, yeah, you can connect to us, but you can't output onto the grid. And so the question is, with a intelligent grid output, you can dump all this surplus electricity into your home load on the non-backup side without producing so much, allowing so much that surplus is overproducing relative to your home and therefore outflowing onto the grid. Now, this is an off-grid model. I'm not going to spend too much more time on it, but we're getting this data from PV Watts. This is a solar performance. Well, I guess this is a solar slide, so we should just move on. But PV Watts is a solar performance data slide and data tool, and what we're doing is downloading the hourly solar performance report. We're setting a peak battery capacity side, and we're subtracting our load from that capacity. Yeah. Batteries they perform better when they're not fully utilized. Whether it be a lead acid battery that has a reputation for, don't discharge that battery all the way or it won't charge back up again. Even lithium ion batteries have the same thing where, if they operate towards the very bottom of their range, they take more damage on their anodes and cathodes than if they are operating up at the top of their full state of charge. The degradation on that cathode and anode really has to do with two things. One, just the duration of the discharge, and then two, the relative storage capacity that's left in the battery, because that's kind of the same thing as having a battery that's just half as large as the larger battery. If you have the same load on the battery and it is discharging a battery that's half the size, that's going to be even harder on the battery than if it was getting a gentler rate of discharge. So it shouldn't surprise you that more damage occurs towards the bottom of the battery when you're operating at a low capacity versus a high capacity. You get settings that'll tell you, once the battery bank reaches, this far of a depth of discharge, should you stop selling back to the grid. An intelligent grid sellback would not just tell you the minimum threshold. The Schneider inverter that lacks intelligence for selling back to the grid says, well, stop selling when the battery voltage reaches this level, but it only gives you one rate of discharge. And that's problematic because the home load actually jumps up and down. But in an off-grid setting, the conservative design would be, on the time frame of your very deepest discharge rate, still having 20% left in your capacity is a good model, a good conservative model. So in off-grid design, we would track out how many days of cloudy weather we had in a row from PV watts, and we would look at how much energy the solar array is dumping in from PV watts, and we take our 12-month electrical bills and break those 12-month periods into daily periods, into hourly periods, add them and subtract them from each other, and based on the size of the solar array and the maximum size of the battery bank, we start to build out just this model in a spreadsheet. Nothing complicated going on, just addition, subtraction, a maximum battery bank size and a minimum battery bank size. Looking at some different looking at some different technologies, we got the industrial flooded lead acid, kind of top of the line lead acid battery. It's rated for 3,000 cycles at an 80% depth of discharge. The Tesla entry level lithium ion is rated for slightly more cycles than that. Then we get to lithium iron phosphate, a little bit more high end of a technology, and it comes with a higher price, but it also comes with more cycles. And so the cost per cycle, I don't think that this price from China for lithium iron phosphate is particularly good. Whenever I price them out from like reputable manufacturers, they're up at like $700 a kilowatt hour. So I think this is should be a little bit more direct. Basically, when I compare the Tesla Powerwall cost per cycle with lithium iron phosphate, they come out to be about neck and neck. They come out to be about the same. And so residential, building designers are preferring lithium iron phosphate for two reasons. The first is customers who have the money to spend, a little bit superfluously on batteries generally have the money to spend on lithium iron phosphate versus Tesla. If you get more cycles out of it and the cycles cost the same, then the cost of maintenance becomes kind of the driver. So they don't have to worry as much about lithium iron phosphate. Also, lithium iron phosphate is less of a fire hazard than entry level lithium ion. So it's a safer technology. And so because it is a higher end technology that over time should result in a cheaper cycle life, and it has some safety, it's a little bit less prone to catch on fire. Lithium iron phosphate is a common standard solution if you have the money for it. At the same time, the Tesla is also popular if a little bit limited in availability. Lithium iron phosphate has about the same charge and discharge rate as the Tesla lithium cobalt. There are higher end lithium battery technologies that can do even more cycles with even faster charges and discharges that are emerging, but they're still rare to find. Either they're from like no-name manufacturers from a murky supply chain, or they're still in experimental development, pilot projects. There's a company out of Maine called Kilowatt Labs that does a lithium titanate battery. Let's keep going a little bit. So, as far as which batteries are the cheapest, well, I would say that Tesla is kind of the front runner. Although you have to actually be able to buy it. And whenever I go to a solar supplier, they don't have Tesla. It's a closed off supply chain. And so the absence of a widespread supply chain and the inability to really become a installer for it, means that not everyone's going to be able to get the Tesla, even if they want it. And then when I go and price out other entry level lithium ion batteries like the LG Chem battery, it becomes a little bit more expensive. And so Really, the any lithium ion battery that you can actually buy, they're in a close pack, and so lithium iron phosphate is a standard solution as well. I wouldn't go with nickel iron. That's kind of a lead acid style battery that does require some maintenance. The only other battery chemistry that I think is really interesting is a lithium NMC battery. This is the technology that I think is going to be standard on the commercial market. Basically, it costs 3 times as much as a Tesla battery, but it can be discharged, 3 to 4 times as fast as a Tesla battery, and that doesn't translate necessarily into more cycles. It's kind of like a turbocharged lithium ion cobalt, whereas lithium iron phosphate, its strength is not its discharge rate that is similar to lithium cobalt. Its strength is in longer cycles. So here's a different lithium ion technology whose strength is not longer cycles, but instead is a faster discharge rate. So that we spend more time on in a commercial class. So Simply Phi is and Sonin are popular lithium iron phosphate tech. Tesla, LG Chem, popular kind of lithium ion. The main difference is that the lithium ion batteries will last a shorter period of time, and therefore the project will cost a little bit less money. Now, the big difference between these grid tied batteries like the Tesla and what you would do in kind of an off grid solar market is the battery bank voltage. So, not all lithium ion batteries are high voltage. You can find 48-volt, LG Chem battery stacks, but the overall industry trend, and I think what will take over the market, is higher voltage battery banks, and that makes it really hard to connect kind of legacy solar systems into batteries. But in some ways it brings it closer together too, because solar operates at high voltage. A volt times an amp is a watt. So if you're increasing your voltage, you're decreasing your amperage. And what was constraining 48-volt systems is how much power you can get out of the battery. If you raise the voltage, you can get more power out of the battery without raising the amperage. And so the practical difference is on a low voltage, high amperage system, you get these big giant battery cables that are 4-aught, big thick welding cables the size of large tree branches. That it's not to mess around with. I showed up to a home and saw a hobbyist uh, do it yourself battery, and it had tiny little wires coming out of it. And it's like, oh, okay, this is for a high voltage battery bank because it's high voltage and little amperage. Well, we had a 48-volt battery inverter. I was like, okay, well, this is not going to be compatible with the lithium ion battery because it had such small wires, and I had a even when you get into 12 kilowatts of power, you're at 4-aught cable size when you're up at 48 volts. So we went out to this project and the battery had these little tiny wires off of it. And it's like, oh, that's for a high voltage battery bank. We have a low voltage battery inverter. It's not going to work. It says, no, that's a 48-volt battery. And it's like, okay, well, if you decrease the voltage, you increase the amperage. And so if you have a low voltage battery, you got to have big giant battery cables coming out of it if you're powering a heavy load. And we were putting on a 12 kilowatt inverter for the whole house. Basically the guy who provided the battery for the project and the guy who provided the solar array for the project, it was an untenable design. So this guy bought this battery inverter that he looked at his battery and said it was a 48-volt battery. He got a 48-volt battery inverter. He went and bought a lithium-ion battery pack and said, I don't need, a lot of backup power for my house. I don't need a full day's worth or whatever. And the size of the inverter, the output capacity of the inverter is going to limit how much is going to throttle how much power can be dragged out of these things. And so, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you have a 12 kilowatt inverter and then you're drawing it at 48 volts, that's 12,000 kW divided by 48 volts. You're gonna be drawing about 250 amps out of it. And so these low voltage systems on the DC side get to be very high amperage. So if you're ever looking at a battery and you have a very tiny wire out of it and you're trying to pull a very large load out of it, that's a safety issue. Is that now we can have lithium ion batteries designed for high voltage, and we also have lithium ion batteries designed for low voltage. And you have to be aware of what the discharge rate of the device is that you're putting onto it, so that you don't exceed the technical capabilities of the batteries themselves. Because if you do, the batteries can catch on fire, as would any overloaded electrical device that's pulling more amperage than what it's rated for. So we deploy kind of some smart home load control to optimize the battery. And you're starting to see more smart electric management products for managing batteries, and that's not to be confused with a battery management system. Most batteries come with a battery management system that's basically reading the voltages and amperages of either individual batteries or groups of the batteries in order to gauge battery health through constant individual monitoring. In the interest of time, we're going to save some energy server discussion for a later day. It's more of a commercial, multiple complex system discussion. But in our smart home load control class, we talk about how you can monitor the home power by putting your own energy meter in front of the meter and clamping around the main power lines that come into the grid. And any intelligent grid tied battery inverter, you're gonna have to do the same thing. If you're buying a battery inverter and your intent is to produce a zero outflow system where you're not selling back to the grid, and you're not buying a whole house inverter, you're just buying something that can back up the whole house, you have to communicate between the battery inverter and the meter. Otherwise, the battery inverter can only control what's on its critical side and not what's on the other side of it. So the smartest battery inverters now come with kind of current transducer consumption meters to go inside your electric service panel and communicate back with the battery inverter. In our smart home class, we talk about how you can use these meters to manage not just batteries, but the load, so that you can use things like your refrigerators and freezers and electric water tanks as batteries. Given what we know about batteries, that the faster you discharge them, the harder it is on the battery. Anything that you do to take peak load off of the battery during the times of peak rates of discharge, that will only improve your battery life and battery economics. So how do you get your load profile information? If you're backing up a critical load panel, you can't, what's your maximum load going to be? Either you're being very conservative in what you're putting on that critical load panel, or you're actively managing the power on that critical load panel to do some load shifting. there's no better way to capture this data than to put a service panel monitor in your service panel and monitor the circuits before you do a battery backup project. The other way is to just make assumptions, and while you know, maybe you could say, okay, well, my assumption is that my peak load is going to be 2 or 3 times larger than my base load. You know, what graphs like these load profiles do is they smooth out the actual load. You know, the actual load is spiky. You know, it's dropping and then spiking up and then dropping and then spiking up and then dropping. And so, you know, your actual load power output requirements could be very different than just what a smooth interval data can deliver. So even 15-minute by 15-minute interval data cannot be, you know, the whole story. You know, your utility will often provide you this 15-minute interval data, but you can assume that the highest 5-minute load is going to be taller than the highest 15-minute load. We talked about how battery inverters are easier to locate. In the interest of time, I want to do a couple of code comments and then conclusions, and then we'll call it a day. But batteries that are lithium ion are required to be listed. So potentially, if you take electric vehicle batteries and you repurpose them for building storage, an electrical inspector could say, you know, those batteries were intended for a car, not a building, and so they're not listed for purpose. So while I think there's a lot of merit to building your own lead acid battery banks, those instances really should be confined to where the battery box is at the very least outside of the building, either in its own container or in a garage. You know, there are disconnect requirements for the batteries. You know, at the very least, there should be a disconnect within sight of the battery. So even if you have your battery system set up on digital load control so you can press a button and turn off all the parts, you know, you still need a visible disconnect. And if you have a kind of intelligent system, and so you have fewer disconnects, you still need a disconnect near the battery that can be lock the battery in a de-energized position. You know, batteries can conduct electricity themselves, so they should be kind of on an insulated pad or an insulated rack. There's a section for battery storage that applies to batteries that are over 60 volts. And so one way to get rid of some of the battery room requirements in terms of protection is to keep the system voltage low. But the short of it is, and we already talked about that there are ventilation requirements. The battery should be 1 inch between the cell container and the wall or structure. Usually that's taken care of by the battery case. But this is kind of the important one, is that you have to prevent accidental contact between the battery and the parts. And so in particular, you know, if you're putting the Tesla Powerwall on the wall, you know, taking the time to hide the wiring into the wall, you know, versus the conduit coming out of the wall, you know, an inspector might say, well, someone could bump into that and it could be a hazard. You know, another nice idea, if you're putting, say, the battery in a garage rather than a closet, would be to put a cage in front of it so that people can't, you know, hit from the car and go into the battery. So there's more cost involved in locating the battery than just the battery itself. High voltage batteries do have code mandated protection, physical protection requirements. And furthermore, in the solar side of things, our DC circuits are mandated to be in metal conduit. And so I could easily see, for physical protection reasons, not for grounding, just for physical protection. And I could easily see this metal conduit requirement making its way into battery conductors as well, saying that they should be protected a little bit more than just with a plastic conduit when inside a building. We're gonna do a code class for NEC systems. There's only so much you can do in 2 hours, and we're already over time, and I need to wrap up. But the takeaway here is that grid tied battery systems, just buying one system, just buying the Tesla Powerwall, or even just a $10,000 project with a of $5,000 of lithium ion batteries and $5,000 of battery inverter components, plus how labor fits into that. That's not going to give you whole house backup power. An entry level lithium ion project is going to be about 5 kilowatts of power, kind of like the Tesla Powerwall spec. And you would have to think either, okay, well, that gives me 5 kilowatts of backup load capacity, whether it's a home or business. And if you need more than that, then you just get more inverters, more battery capacity, until your output gets there. But you're not going to power the whole building off of a $20,000, even a $20,000 project. We're talking more in lines of $40,000-$50,000 just as a minimum starting point for a power hungry residential home or small commercial system. So that makes it very hard to avoid wiring critical load panels, and rewiring a service panel to be a service panel with a critical load panel is a couple $1,000 job as well. So there is a motivation to say, well, I'm just going to wait till I do a whole house off grid system. But the technologies are getting better. It's just right now, you might have to choose, but you still have to choose which appliances do you want on an automatic backup. One thing you can do is if you want to power your whole house off of your small battery backup inverter, is you could take the critical load side to it and then put it on a manual transfer switch. And the cheap way to do it, this is called a interlock switch, and it makes sure that only your main breaker or this kind of backup generator can be on at the same time. And so you could, if you were limiting your whole house to just the 5 kilowatt draw, you could run your whole house from the main panel by using a generator interlock panel. At the same time, you'd have to be sure to not create a feedback loop, and you'd have to turn off the grid side charger, since the inverter would be charging the grid. If the inverter starts charging itself, it's just going to drain all of its energy as fast as it can. But your standard lithium-ion grid-tied inverter is not intended to back up your whole house, just a critical load panel. In fact, the intelligence for any kind of grid-side savings is just now coming to battery inverters themselves. Most battery inverters do not have intelligent grid-side management, so you have to be careful with that. Let's see, what else do we got in this presentation? This is just illustrating some points. Batteries are stackable. Most of you are going to be into class tomorrow, so we'll kind of pick up from there. But at any rate, when I do battery modeling, there is a free software out there called the System Advisor Model that you can download. I use a commercial software called Energy Toolbase, and we just have some extra kind of slides on this. So we've made it to the end of our program. If you want a copy of the handout, send me an email. If you want access to this recording, send me an email. Otherwise, you have a good day, and thank you for attending the program. Stop taking their calls.